Adam McKeown will speak for half an hour. He will explain himself, what his topic is and why he thinks it's so interesting. Then Juan will give a short comment and then there will be time for discussion. My role as a chair will be limited to being rude to both speakers and shutting them up when they go over their allotted time slot, because then you have more time for discussion. So, Adam.
Okay, well, thanks so much. It's really an honor to be chosen for this. You didn't mention my book, Melancholy.
I had it here.
Yeah.
The book which made him famous is The Likely Order on Asian migration and American immigration.
Well, more generally, it's a history of I claim that's actually a history of the origins of modern migration control per se. And while I was writing it, I was definitely inspired a lot I read lots of the social science, legal writings about migration control, and they inspired me a lot. And when I was trying to write the conclusion, I was really working hard. How can I speak back to this? How can I respond to this? What can history do to these kinds of contemporary social scientific thinking? And it turned out to be really, really difficult for me. I must have went through 8, 10 versions of the conclusion that I ripped up and started again. I mean, I thought I'd went into it with some pretty clear ideas, because I find lots of social science literature. I mean, historians always think that there's lots of erasures going on. The history is really simplified. I mean, the two really clear erasures are common is one that just the scope, scale, organization of historical migrations are routinely forgotten. Now we're in this new age where the volume and the transnationality and all this stuff of migration is unprecedented. But really, the transnational organization has been there all the time. The volume of past, especially Asian migration. There was as many migrants in the Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia as there were into the Americas. This is routinely forgotten. And so migration in the present's always made to seem like this crisis, this new challenge we have. We've got to reform. We've got to deal with this crisis, this constant sense of crisis that comes out of this forgetting. And the other kind of forgetting is this forgetting that modern migration control is actually a fairly recent thing. There's all these discussions of, classic border control, and it's often traced back to Westphalia, seen as inherent to the nature of the territorial nation state. It's not inherent at all. It was a very new thing, very self-consciously constructed from about the 1880s to the 1920s. And the process of reform, and another part of this forgetting is thinking the ideas of reform are these new ideas from this kind of status thing that has just been encrusted and in place since Westphalia. But usually most reform ideas, reform has been part of migration control from day one. Most ideas about how to reform migration control are the same ideas people had 100 years ago, are the same ideas that created precisely the kinds of things that we think need reforming now. And it's again, this kind of forgetting just helps the whole cycle go forward. So these ideas that came into it, I thought I had, but I still just had a really hard time thinking, okay, I have this historical perspective still. So what? How does that really change lots of the theorizing about engaging in contemporary migration control? I mean, I found I had no suggestions how to change anything. I found when I really tried to engage, sometimes just the ideas were so nuanced and varied, I couldn't quite make the historical thing stick to anything. On the other hand, the opposite feeling I had is sometimes when I tried to speak to the contemporary stuff, it uses a particular kind of language and discourse and concepts that always feel constraining to me. Once you start talking that way, you have to talk like them. You can't bring in the historical perspective. And as I thought about this, I realized instead of trying to engage, what I was really trying to do was think about how it became possible to talk about migration control in the way it's talked about. where do these assumptions come from? The idea that migration control happens at borders, national borders. The idea that it is generally thought of as a domestic law, not something you negotiate, like trade is still negotiated, but a domestic law that is accompanied by concepts like integration, assimilation, the economic contribution of migrants to the place they're residing. The whole debate between trying to find the middle ground between national interests and the human rights and rights of migrants, and trying to find some balance between this. How is it that this has become such a common way to talk about migration? The categories like workers, refugees, students, merchants, all these various categories that any 19th century official would have thought made no sense whatsoever. How do we take this as for granted as the places to start thinking about migrants? And just the basic idea that how is it we think that, migration control is this systematic discrimination on the basis of health, wealth, place of birth, family, citizenship, political ideas, level of education. How do we take it for granted in all these countries that it's not only tolerable to discriminate on that basis, but it's actually justifiable. It's a good idea in most people's minds. And oddly enough, the racial discrimination, where migration control really started, has kind of been pushed under, and it's thought it's no good to discriminate that way, but it's good to discriminate every other way in migration control. How did these things come to be? And I'm not sure. And so what I'm going to do in my in the talk here is summarize again some of this historical narrative of how this came to be. The general things I want to focus on is, I'm going to argue that migration control, modern immigration control, really has its origins at creating the boundaries between the West and Asia. And that these things that were once thought to be this really exceptional necessity to distinguish civilized from the uncivilized then became the norm between all nations. Also, I want to emphasize that migration control is not this thing that's always been there with states. It emerges out of this complex dynamic between all kinds of people, law and order types, reformists, liberal lawyers, migrants trying to smuggle, all kinds of people come in and make this. And it's a constant site of tension between communitarian individualism, between law and order types and humanitarian rights types. Reform doesn't change migration control. Reform is migration control from day one as part of the process. And then also that one of the real effects of it is part of the larger process of creating new identities for the world, tearing people out of old social identities where you're pretty much defined by who knows you and who will guarantee you, and redefining you in terms of bureaucratic categories, legal categories, cross-reference files. And the core of this is both the nation and reducing everybody into these free individual, the self-motivated, self-determining individual that can be put into these categories. Not the socially networked individual, but the free individual is one of the key ways that has made, and what this leads to is defining the kinds of people that, what I call the globalizing classes versus the non-globalizing classes, the people who are free to move compared to those who can only move with lots of trouble. And if I have time, I'll try to tie this into how some of these ideas still shape some of our ideas about guest laborers and trafficking. But we've always had mobility controls throughout history. Before the late 19th century, most of them were focused on stopping exit, controlling domestic mobility, or were enacted more often than not at the local level, the level of villages, the level of towns, of ports, and not only by stopping mobility, but by through discriminatory taxes, discriminatory residence, various kinds of privileges and disabilities. And the attack on migration controls that happened in the mid-19th century in the North Atlantic world was part and parcel of this attack upon local powers and local privileges. I mean, from the 1850s to 1870s was really an era of free mobility within the Atlantic world. Places like China or Russia that still restricted mobility. This was proof of their backwardsness, proof of their lack of civilization. The fact that they would restrict mobility. But like I said, part of this erasing of these laws was also an act of a centralization of power, getting rid of local power. So when migration control did come back in, it came back in at a national level, with thinking of national borders rather than of other kinds of smaller spaces. And where these borders first came was I would argue, at the dividing line between Europe, North America, and Asia. The one side of this, the Eastern Mediterranean, the space between the Ottoman and Europe. Russia sometimes could fall on both sides. It could be Europe sometimes, it could be Asia sometimes. But this was a key place for lots of modern migration things. This is where some of the first systematic health inspections of everybody who passed through, not just quarantine, but everybody passed through, across the Black Sea between the Ottoman and Russia, and later on between Russia and Germany, were some of the first places where you had systematic health inspections of everybody. Also, the population exchanges between the Ottoman and the Balkans were some of the first places for modern mass refugee control or asylum laws and humanitarianism, whereas asylum used to be these sort of high-profile political individuals. These are some of the first places where you design procedures and camp and humanitarian interventions to deal with mass refugee flows, and also sort of attempts to control the pilgrimage into Mecca, the Hajj. Some of the first state attempts to really use state-issued passports rather than this sort of these personal passports, directly issued by the Secretary of State under his name, or the President of Yale to the individual, but systematic state passports. And the other side, the side that I've looked at in my work, the control of East Asians into what I would call the white settler nations, like California, British Columbia, Australia, is a place where I think the nuts and bolts of modern migration control really emerged. The sort of control through categorization and through what Aristide Zolberg calls remote control, essentially visas, determining identities before they leave even. And the passport doesn't really matter so much whether you can enter a country, as the visa is really what controls your movement. The passport probably facilitates it more than controls it, if you can get one at least. This is a space, and the places that really pioneered this new kind of border immigration control were, like I said, these white settler nations, which in many ways were the most progressive, most egalitarian, most committed to self-determination and self-rule places in the world. Usually very committed to democracy, self-rule, great participation, and very often seen as the first principle of a self-ruling, self-determining people is to determine who the heck these people are in the first place, and keeping out the people who aren't part of the people. I mean, so migration control comes hand in hand with this egalitarian democracy in its origins. I mean, very often the opposition was seen as capitalists. It was seen as people, I mean, these are often the most vociferous free movement for everybody kinds of people, and they were the enemies of these egalitarian, anti-Chinese migration control people, because it was seen that their use of free mobility was precisely to bring in cheap labor, undermine the dignity of a republic, undermine the dignity of the laborer. It was a very clear opposition between the capitalists who promoted this free mobility and the Democrats, the egalitarian, who thought about the community. And in the sake of time, I'll skip lots of the false starts in migration that happened in the 1850s and 80s. It's really, I think, the U.S. laws that Chinese exclusion laws established in 1882 that really set the tone for future migration control. Other kinds of things like the Australian dictation test that in many ways is much more effective, by the 1920s or 30s gave way in practice to the U.S. ones, which were based on categorization. Not quotas, not poll taxes, but Chinese laborers could not enter, and merchants, students, family members, diplomats could enter, and figuring out who was allowed to move and who was not allowed to move. The first attempt by the U.S. to enact these laws was just widely attacked. Europeans and China just mocked the Americans. Oh, the Americans want to enter China, but then they stopped the Chinese from entering the United States. Those Americans are foolish. This is against the basic principles of development and freedom and economics, blah, blah, blah. Lots of American judges were really opposed to it. They worried, even if this was justifiable for this exceptional case of the threat of the Chinese, what will happen if we start imposing these same kinds of laws on everybody? And this is one of the real big worries, that it would go past this sort of exceptional moment. But over the course of the 1880s and 90s, several legal decisions were made, this massive diplomatic offensive that really started to convince people that, yes, national borders are a legitimate place to stop mobility, that immigration law is a domestic law, which this really entailed disentangling migration from commerce, from trade and goods. Early to mid-19th century, people talk about all these things together as intercourse. When you started creating immigration laws, there's also a real process of saying, no, the movement of people is something fundamentally different than the movement of goods and trade. And this is one of the really key changes. Because of time, one of the other really key changes is, forgive me, because of time, I'm not going to cover the details, but reformulating the source of rights, not in the people themselves, but rights coming out of institutions. It's precisely the institutions of the United States and Europe that make people free. It's not the fact that you are a migrant and a person that makes you free to move, but it is the freedom of free mobility and enjoying trial by jury and the good things in the United States or in European countries that make you free, unlike, say, Asian countries where institutions don't give you those freedoms. So therefore, these rights naturally stop at the border, because these rights emanate from institutions rather than from people, is one of the big changes that go on. And forgive me, I think this is a really important change, but going through the details is not quite the appropriate thing to do in only 30 minutes. So it's one thing to proclaim these things, and over the next 40 years, Australia and the United States just, hammered on these every chance they got, and really started to convince, in ideological terms and also practical terms. So other people wanted to migrate to these places, they had to do all the paperwork, they had to produce the documents, they had to do it if they weren't going to get turned away at the United States by the US or Argentina or Australia. So over the next 20 years, these sorts of things had their key emergence, and racism became norms between all countries. But another thing to enforce them. You can proclaim these categories, but enforcing them is an altogether different proposition. One thing is, like I said, reform was part of these from day one. The original laws in all these countries, the enforcement was dispersed between different states, between different departments within the government and all of these nations. And from day one, making them work was the process of centralizing them, all of the knowledge, all of the different officials involved in it, giving them a common mission, a common understanding of how to enforce. In many ways, I've just been reading some stuff about the difficulties of creating migration law in the EU, and these great things about how there's no centralized decision making, but these constant emails and conferences and talking. And the key thing is just creating these common concepts, this common way of talking about things, these glossaries, so that everybody is on the same page and understanding what a migrant is and what's a good way to regulate him. And this was going on again from day one in the enforcement of the exclusion laws. It was, how do you centralize? How do you get all the officers on the same page, understanding what a migrant is and how he can be regulated? which had to do with the constant refinement, negotiation, and the proliferation of categories. I mean, I think, migration reform more than anything just tends to be the refinement and proliferation of categories, and how do we get people to fit into those categories. What you can really see that, I mean, historically, identification very often went through guarantors. How do you want to know who somebody is? You ask a local official, you ask a local elite, who is that person? He guarantees him. That person gets in trouble. You can come down on the person who guaranteed him. There's these networks of identity. But suddenly the US government is trying to identify somebody in a forest jurisdiction. They can lie, the guarantors can lie, you can do all kinds of things, and really, there's nothing the US can do about it. They can't punish the person who guarantees it if they're back in China. There's no way to guarantee these identities. And you have these things there. At the time of China reform, they would ask the consuls who are giving visas, how do you know who to give a visa to as a true merchant or not a true merchant? And they tell these stories, well, they'll go to their local headman, who then will take them into Canton and take them to a local banker, and we'll get a bond made, and then the banker and the headman, the migrant, will all go and introduce him to the local, the Dao Tai, the Chinese official, who will make more papers, and then an official from there, and all of them will come to my office, and they'll guarantee this guy. And I'll only give visas to people who are introduced to me by my two best buddies, these bankers whom I really trust. Totally letting local networks produce identity. After about these 15 years of consular reform, bureaucratic reform, these very same officials who said, the categories are absurd. How do I know who's a laborer and who's a merchant? They're all farmers. When they go to Hong Kong, this week if they have money, they're peddling and selling things down in the docks and the shops. When they run out of money, then they're working and carrying things. How do I know what they're going to do when they get to the United States? 10 years later, these very same guys are saying, because now they've been told, these are the categories, these are the kinds of documentations, these are the things you're looking for. And they're saying, I can tell if you're a laborer or a merchant just by looking at you. I can see it written on your body, the way you behave, the way you carry yourself. But you know how I can do it? The only way I can do it is by getting rid of the middlemen. All those people who were once the guarantees of identity, now they're the guarantees of lies. It was said these merchants who may be honest in all their dealings always lie when it comes to migration. The only way we can know the truth is sort of the eyeball-to-eyeball contact with the individual themselves. Who they are is carried on their body. But this is really only knowable because now they had really clear definitions of what a merchant was, what a student was, and very often these definitions had a lot to do with a student is not somebody who gets recruited to go to the United States through middlemen and brokers or nice Christian philanthropists. They are people who just, out of their own inspiration, sitting back in the village, want to learn. Again, even the motivation was crucial to defining who these people were, that kind of individualism. And of course, this generated 5 minutes. Oh, okay, I thought 8. Okay, so I'm going to cut that even shorter. This created a huge amount of fraud. It was in order to document family relations, false villages, false families were created. When you came to the U.S., you memorized this book of 600 questions. And the amazing thing is the immigration officials, they knew about all this fraud. They knew that the more they did these cross-reference files, extensive interviews, and filed all the knowledge, the easier it was to lie, because the facts are all there. You could know them. You knew exactly how to present yourself. Once you had these categories, it could be learned how to present yourself in such a way that would allow you through. And they knew all this, and they still claimed their mission was to find out the truth of who each migrant was. And yet, whenever they proposed reform, their proposals were always more files, more interviewing, more cross-referencing. And as far as I can tell, despite the claims, the point was not to find out who these people really were. It was to take them out of these old social networks and replace them with new networks of identity described by the files, described by these new categories. And whatever the migrants, and even if the migrants can learn to perform this, but the key was they would then have to re-perform the same identity over and over again every time they crossed the border or wanted relatives to come in or friends to come in. Over the long term, whether the migrants felt it or not, this was their identity. They were being recreated as these new people who now have the power and the identity to move. And this is something you can still really, you hear about so much in asylum cases or in trying to, taking, victims of trafficking into court and trying to, the way that you have to be trained and taught how to present yourself as a particular victim. I mean, in addition to the wealthy people free to move, and this is a new kind of identity of these are other people who get a legitimate kind of claim to move. If you can present your experience in such a way that fulfills asylum laws, that fulfills some kind of description of victimization, and more than anything, it is training you how to become a global citizen or a particular class of global citizen. The whole process of going through this is it's part of this broader reconstruction of contemporary identity in the world, both at the bureaucratic level, but I would say in the long term, even at a kind of personal level. So, I mean, to bring it back to what does history have to offer, I'm still not clear what this says. Okay, we have this system, what do we do with it? But at the very least, I think it shifts the emphasis. The problems we have in migration control are not something new that have just emerged in this moment of globalization or neoliberal privatization or whatever it is that's happening right now, that these are things that have been developing over the past 200 years, and that the tensions and contradictions in migration control, you're not going to solve the problems by taking one side or another, because they've been there within the creation of it. I mean, all those lawyers are trying to help migrants in many ways by helping them to perform themselves as asylum cases, as merchants, as who it is, are also reinforcing the very kinds of structures that are at the foundation of migration control. And since I didn't talk about the trafficking again, I will stop there with the last conclusion. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. Juan Amaya-Castro is, I always forget the right terminology. He's from the University of Amsterdam, and he will speak for at most 15 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers for asking me to be here today. I feel very privileged. In particular, I feel that Adam McKeown's work on the history of migration control marks a veritable before and after event for migration scholars. A Melancholy Order is a type of book that makes one wonder, so what did we know before about the history of migration control? In this way, it is leaving an enormous footprint on the scholarly landscape. I will do my best here to engage your work in the most challenging fashion. In doing so, I must admit that I am quite indebted to the work of Professor Sasson. And these last days I have felt very much that I am maneuvering in the shadow of giants, even as I have also felt like a predatory cannibal voraciously appropriating other people's work for my own projects on migration law from a global perspective. So it is by no means a caveat when I say that I very much hope that my observations are filled with mistranslations or with what Harold Bloom called misreadings. So 3 things. One thing that I take from Adam's history of migration control is his emphasis on its continuities, its recurrences, and its repetitions. Indeed, there seems to be nothing new under the sun. However, even if it is the same old wine that has been moving around from older to old and to newer bottles, I do nevertheless want to focus on those bottles a bit. I will start by talking about the role of technology in this story. In your account, technology plays an appropriately neutral role in the background, as it has, throughout the centuries, facilitated new forms of mobility control, it has also facilitated new forms of mobility itself. Technology can, in this sense, be seen as utilized by both cat and mouse in their age-old game. But in doing so, as Adam work emphasizes, it has also constructed the cat as cat and the mouse as such. In other words, technological developments mark points in which new types of identity can be produced. Whether it is the technology that allows for the production of the material upon which letters of introduction can be written with ink that stays legible, or whether it is about making it possible to add people's picture or their fingerprint to these documents themselves, and onto the contemporary shifts away from these documents and onto digitized biometrics and automatized face recognition, etc., it seems as if la révolution identificatoire has only just begun. I'm not merely talking about the billions of euros that governments in Europe and the US are spending on the development of these new technologies, in yet another attempt to control mobility. I'm sure that this control, as always, will be selective and riddled with previously unimaginable cracks and loopholes. What I am referring to is the way in which technologies become, in fact, the new materiality, the new corporal language of identity. What I'm referring to is the way that even as we see the old language of walls and fences to control migration being deployed with renewed gusto, we can also see the proliferation of these walls invisibly in the ubiquitous presence of technologies of surveillance. The new bogeyman, the irregular migrant, is not merely always trying to get in. She is, in fact, always already inside, trying to get a job, trying to suck away the life of the welfare state, trying to commit crimes, feeding the belly of the underground. Mobility control has to be ubiquitous now. And it is this faculty that has fed what Dennis Broeders has called the deputization of ordinary citizens for the performance of migration control. Keywords here from the US context are attrition through enforcement and e-verify, in what I have called in a recent publication illegality regimes, normative and policy regimes by which the checkpoint becomes ubiquitous and by which everybody becomes involved, perhaps the ultimate re-privatization. As migration control becomes, thanks to wonderful new technologies, ubiquitous and constant, and as we shift from the document onto its new materiality, the body, Adam's book allows us to see that we have been here before, that the body has always already been inscribed with markers of mobility control, that mobility control has always been ubiquitous, just in different ways. Even so, what happens to your story what happens to your story if you foreground rather than background these bottling techniques, the technologies of mobility control themselves? If you see the body as the historical terrain of constant reinscription of identities, always unleashing new economies of domination and resistance, and always, as we heard yesterday from Sarah, always re-articulating intimacies as well. In other words, amidst the continuities, the recurrences, and the repetitions, are there also increases in intensity or changes in density? Even if mobility control is better at producing identities than at controlling mobility, is the révolution identificatoire nevertheless changing the world, or is it too early to say? My second point is related, and in particular to what you in your concluding chapter identify as the trend of proliferation of categories in migration control. Indeed, add to this administrative sophistication the increasing recourse to bilateral migration agreements, return of the negotiation, and we can see an increasing differentiation in the production of migrant identities. My question relates to the labor market, another of the more backgrounded protagonists in your story. The neoliberal labor market seems to require this growing differentiation of migrant categories, and not just to refer to various types of legal migrants, but also to a growing diversity of irregular migrants, such as victims of human trafficking, irregular migrants that have managed to go to college, that have criminal records, etc. These differentiations produce types of identities that map out differently onto the labor market. Some of these identities are more precarious than others, while even others are of the privileged red carpet treatment, such as us academics, for example. Though they may have different types and degrees of mobility, all these categories are very much about labor mobility. In all this, the idea of the free migrant may still dominate, but it may also be undergoing some qualitative transformations as the individual profile, another technological innovation, requires continuous maintenance and re-articulations for the needs of the labor market. My question relates to the increasing role played by emigration states. And I'm thinking of the Philippines or Bangladesh, who have stepped up to assist their nationals abroad, increasingly in modalities of so-called circular migration. Could we be seeing a new type of brokerage here? Can you see this as part of the paradigm of migration management with its three wins? You know, everybody wins, the immigration state wins, the immigration state wins, and the migrant wins. For sure, private brokers and employers will still be central actors, but what about the possibility for states themselves? Finally, another actor that has been transforming itself as of late, looking for a role to play in the mobility control game, are, of course, the cities. In the Netherlands, we have seen cities playing a somewhat autonomous role in the context of the so-called integration of immigrants, for instance. But the role of cities is much more complex and sometimes difficult to place. For instance, some cities have recently been resisting efforts by the national government to clamp down on irregular migrants, for example, by limiting their access to shelters or other safety nets. They just refuse to comply. There are, of course, in the US context, the radical example of the sanctuary cities. In any case, there seems to be an increasing friction in the centralized order of the modern state. And to go back to the question of new versus old, is this friction new or is it old? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Because Juan was very short, and indeed I stole 3 minutes from you, I hoped you wouldn't notice, but you did. We now have no less than 16 minutes for discussion. As a listener, I'm inclined to ask Adam for a short response, although it will mean more, but I think I would like that. So could you give in a few minutes
Sure.
respond to Juan's points?
Let me see. On the one hand, that the whole process I'm describing of the emergence of these controls after the 1880s, this is something new. I mean, the whole process is itself something new. I guess the issue is I tend to think as a historian, and my time frame is longer than a human generation, a human lifespan. That this process that's 140 years old, as far as I'm concerned, is a new process. All of the things, the identification revolution, the technological developments, these are all part of something new that's been going on for 140 years. It may be intensifying and maybe not, but I think we're really far from seeing how any of it will be resolved. And I mean, yes, there's this constant, rejiggering of well, I'll come back to that last point. I mean, the technology and bodies, and one thing I do in the work is I don't talk much about the technology, because one of the things I really try to emphasize is that a lot of identity, the bodies are crucial. Being able to identify individual bodies outside of networks of guarantors. I mean, that's just the first step. And then beyond that, once you have those individual bodies, is being able to construct other kinds of new social identities, as certain kinds of occupations, as other kinds of family members, as people with certain educations or whatnot. So the body is the first step very much. And once you have the body separated, then you can start piling on these new cross-referenceable, bureaucratic kinds of identities onto these people. Whether the increasing intensity of detail on the bodies, I'm inclined to say that still pretty much just more and more of the photographs and fingerprints and all those kinds of things that started to identify individual bodies in the first place.
Just to interject there, I mean, we're going from a situation in which, I mean, you talk a lot about the development of an administration that is able to conduct these controls, to a situation in which, it's sort of like completely decentered and ubiquitous. So it's a different intensity, different density, different frequency, even if it's the same act. And it requires different institutions as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that's a good description of what I hope I'd be trying to say in the long run. Because I think one of my largest things about migration control is it's not just the state doing it to us. It is the product of all kinds of actors negotiating, intervening, producing this thing in the midst of all of them that takes over at the same of the people who are producing it themselves. And part of this, and you mentioned the cities and the privatization. I mean, these are two of these long-term tensions that have come up over the past 150 years along with the rise of this. I mean, the 19th century it was really the age of private control of all kinds of things. Lots of migration control was an attack on private organization. It was an attack on padrones and crimps and peoples who were thought to be traditional or to deceive people and to make them into not genuine migrants who was isolated, individually motivated migrant, and a long-term attack, and even planters and all kinds of people who would take it upon themselves to control and dominate certain groups of migrants is a key thing of the rise of state migration control. But what happened along the way is that they'd even attack philanthropists and shipping companies, all kinds of people who might want to intervene in the mobility of people. This fantasy of these kinds of free markets of isolated individuals making choices. But along the way, what happened is that certain institutions, shipping companies most notably at the time, learned how to cooperate with these, learned how to enforce the laws. And I think in the reprivatization we see now, it's not power being pulled away from the states, but we're seeing a much more intense collaboration of private and public in terms of guest laborers, in terms of airplanes enforcing lots of the migration laws. But and also a continued dependence even on what you might call semi-legitimate recruiters, because every guest labor law between the employers and the state that work, they still depend on all kinds of recruiters. And just like with indenture, when things go wrong, you blame these guys who are underground. And then the other kinds of recruiters who haven't developed this kind of cooperation with the state, these are the traffickers. These are the ones that are just demonized totally. That you carry on that whole story of padrones and evil, corrupt deceivers and all kinds of this. So any sort of exploitation that is not the collaboration of the state is then trafficking. So it's still, you're seeing the sort of the private, public, or private state struggle just being reformulated in different ways. And what you pointed about the cities is, I think it's a good point. And it just always reminds me that this kind of victory of the state that I see, say, mid-20th century, wasn't quite so victorious. I mean, the struggle that I saw between local and more centralized state in the 19th century, this still has yet to be resolved. I mean, so the big answer to everything you say is I think this is all a process that's been going on for the last 200 years and has yet to be resolved in any place. You see these same tensions rejiggering and reformulating themselves over and over for the past 200 years.
Thank you very, very much. The floor is open. You need a microphone, and I will go and stand on the floor myself. First, I have, maybe it's a silly observation, but your view that the EU immigration laws are, as a lawyer, I experience that as something completely unique, unprecedented, blah, blah, blah. And it will keep me thinking for a while to have heard you say, well, it's just another form of centralization. We've seen it before. So thank you for that. Whom can I give the floor? And the microphone. Sarah.
Well, thanks. Thanks for this presentation and your book, which I thought was really very, very inspiring and very thought-provoking. And just returning to Juan's comment, because one thing I'm wondering, I mean, obviously this centralized system challenged all these networks that have been going on for thousands of years, probably, in regulating migration. I mean, family connections, villages, all kinds of client lists, and I mean, they continued, obviously, and I think a lot of what we call trafficking or smuggling still depends on these kinds of networks. And it probably all works, basically, because those networks still do function. But, of course, it is conceivable that as technology does, become more sophisticated and more ubiquitous, that there could be a critical moment where these networks are under so much pressure that they actually do collapse. And I'm thinking of Scott's Seeing Like the State, where in his conclusion he sort of, I can't remember it exactly, it's a long time I read it, but he did sort of say, well, if there's too much power and too much centralized power and too much technology and not enough of this sort of network chaos, anarchy to contravene, there's not enough breathing space to sort of keep things going on that level. So to what extent do you sense that is a possibility, that it can actually pass that critical moment and become as scary as Juan is sort of suggesting it will be?
Your question, I spent a lot of time in rural Thailand, actually. My partner is rural Thai, and I have two responses. On the one hand, God, it's going to be a long, long time before these things collapse. I mean, that is still the daily vision of so many people in the world, is the personal relationships and what the states want is still. But on the other hand, they're in a part of the world where they're having to register their land, they're having to register their marriages, they're having to get ID cards, they're having to construct birth dates and construct new spellings for their names out of nothing. So I see both things happening at once, and I don't know where I'd fall on that at all. Because on the one hand, people are always going to construct personal relations, and one of the things you see, the more you regulate, the more that gives space for brokers and middlemen and recruiters, because every new regulation is something that most people can't figure out, and it's an opportunity for somebody to manipulate other kinds of ties and provide a service, et cetera, et cetera. So,
migration lawyers,
yeah.
for example.
I mean, I don't think the ties will collapse so much as reformulate themselves. I mean, even say 300 years ago compared to now, I would say these kinds of ties are much more based on family, kinship, village, the kinds of things that process migration than perhaps might have been the case even 300 years ago, when lots of migration was through guilds, occupation, or through military service, or as property, as with slaves. I mean, there are other ways to facilitate mobility. So I think they'll persist, but they'll change their structure, of course.
Good historian, you emphasize continuity, but if you would have to characterize what has happened in the West in the past 50 years, as opposed to the period before, so I'm sure you're going to say it's a change at the surface, but so what, or is it simply a new bottle period?
And I would say what Sarah mentioned in her talk, this process of the individual being the source of being the site of government intervention and the site of structuring laws. I think this is a process that, compared to say 200 years ago, is much more broadly and firmly entrenched. And the technological things that separate your physical body and just all the kinds of legal and ideological stuff that give benefits, privileges, disabilities are based more on you as increasingly as individual, with, again, sort of the state citizenship being the one group thing that really matters. And this is, I think, has been the biggest. And underneath that, like I suggest, I think family ties and kinship ties in some ways have become, I'm not going to go that way. Lots of the alternatives have seemed to have boiled down to that. Lots of the other alternatives that might have been available 300 years ago are slowly, other than being embedded in big corporations and universities. These are the new guilds, the new kinds of institutions that help you move, but which are very different than network ties.
Thank you. One more remark.
Thank you, Adam. I was very struck, and I mean, you've characterized in a very historically grounded way migration control as a system of discrimination, a systemized system of discrimination. And my question to you is how, if migration control is a systemized, is a system of, a very systematic system of discrimination, then how do you reflect on taking migration control as such? Then how do you reflect on the different fields and academic disciplines that look at migration control and how they are implied and related to the state also? I think so many. I think I'm just asking you to reflect on you as a historian and how you look at different academic fields that study not migration but migration control and their relation to the state.
Good question.
And I'm asking you this question because you. In France and in the Netherlands, there's very different relationships of scholars to the state, or there's very different traditions. In the Netherlands, I'm not going to. So.
I think you're throwing me back into the difficulties I had in writing that conclusion. I found it so impossible to give a generalized answer to that. I mean, something I will say is, I'm just pulling it back to the discrimination stuff, is I'm struck, at least in the American Academy, just discrimination means race so often. How this has really become fetishized as the main site of discrimination and something we need to fight against. And in doing so, I mean, just like also, many people who may want to help individuals who are stuck in the bureaucratic system and helping them work their way through it, you repeatedly reinforce the categories that established the system in the first place. And I think, gosh, discrimination of race, I mean, one thing that does is it leaves discrimination based on health, age, education. Some people still attack some of the education and wealth stuff a little bit, but as unquestioned, as meritocratic, as something that is in some ways not discrimination, or is a discrimination of a different order. You often see those distinctions between, I forget, meritocratic versus, I forget what the opposition to meritocratic was, these two different kinds of discriminations, which I think is a bit odd. I mean, so the relations to the state, I mean, you've got plenty of, and it's hard to generalize. I'm thinking here, even the most critical kinds of sociologists or lawyers, there's also plenty who are more than happy to help the UN and IOM just create a global version of domestic migration controls. Just take all the technology, all the sorts of balancing state interests, all the ways of imagining individuals and what a migrant should look like, and just make it into a global regime. And they're very critical of state stuff, but I see much of what's being proposed as a global regime just to be an expansion of the very same thing. And of course, there's plenty of individuals, plenty of academics too, and I can't really divide the disciplines who really love national controls, unless it's how do we make them better. There's no problem with that as far as they're concerned.
Okay. I'm a bit sorry because we were just getting going, but it's time for the next two speakers. So thank you very, very much for your
Thank you.
talks.